Hey everyone, it's Dr. Josh Fox here, and doing something a little bit different today. Remember when everyone was doing them tier lists? Well, we're doing one of those too because I love being just behind the times, you know? It's kind of my thing, in case you couldn't tell. So what we got here is game controllers because, you know, it just seemed right, you know? It just seemed right. As someone who literally did a whole video on game controllers, it kind of seemed like the perfect kind of follow-up. So what we got here is a whole bunch because this is the extensive one. It's gens 2 to 8. So I should mention that this is completely off the cuff. There's no proper scripting here. There's going to be some editing, but there's no proper scripting here. So I'm probably going to make myself sound like an idiot. If I get anything wrong, I don't apologize. Let's dive right in. All right, so we've got 5 different ranks ready to go. We've got S, A, B, C, and poop or D tier. I called it poop because I'm a functioning adult. Okay, so starting from I was gonna say bottom, now we're here, but let's start from the top. The Xbox 360 controller. I don't think there's even like a question. It's definitely like it's an S tier. There's really no other way to describe it. It's an S tier. I mean, like, there are some small things I don't like about it. The heads of the sticks are a little bit rough. They don't feel all particularly pleasant. But the actual sticks themselves are really good. The buttons are really good. The layout of the controller is really good. It feels nice and sturdy. I suppose I should address the D-pad, which is the worst thing about the controller, and Microsoft has always had some issues with D-pads. They've sort of gotten over it, but, like, they're definitely probably the least well-known for their good D-pads, and, yeah, it's primarily because of this fella right here. Okay, so next up is the Sega Saturn 3D Action Pad, I believe it's called. We'll just call it the Sega Saturn 3D Pad. This one's tough, actually, because I feel like it's cool. It's actually a good controller, but it's extremely unorthodox if you actually look at it. In actually a lot of respects, it's really, if you hold it, it feels almost, you know, kind of like how a lot of people say, like, the Xbox and the Dreamcast share, like, a lot in common. This controller, I'd say, shares just about as much in common, or almost as much in common, but it definitely does have some differences, namely the better D-pad and the sort of 6-button kind of controller layout of it, which is what Sega did for a while until the Dreamcast came out. I think putting it in A is pretty confident because, like, it is, despite how it looks, despite how weird it looks, the fact that it kind of looks like a spaceship, it's surprisingly comfortable. Also, the stick is all sorts of weird. It's definitely weird, but in a good way. It's a good kind of weird. So after that, we've got the Atari 2600 controller. Okay, so the Atari 2600 controller, you know, it came out during a time when we hadn't really figured out the best ways to do game controllers yet. You know, there's plenty of old kind of fashioned, old-timey games that are used for it. It's a classic controller, and it's iconic, and important is going insane. Yeah, I like the Atari 2600. I've never been a big fan of the controller. It's very small, and actually, like how are you really supposed to use it? You can't put it down, like, on the desk because it wriggles around, and you try holding it, it just feels so uncomfortable when you're trying to, like press down the button. The button itself is actually fine, but and the stick itself is so uncomfortable. Holding it is fine, but the actual, like, movement of it is extremely stiff, so I'm not particularly fond of this one. I don't think it's aged too well. I have no idea what this is. It just kind of looks like a generic, like, PC kind of joystick. Maybe put it firmly in, like, C tier, because I have no idea what this is, but I also don't want to say, like, it's poop. Okay, so next up is, this one's interesting because it's supposed to be, like, the Gravis Gamepad, which I had to do a super quick kind of, like, look up on Google because I forgot the name. But yeah, this is the Gravis Gamepad, and it's kind of like the penultimate kind of like, class. It's kind of like it's the classic PC gaming controller. You've probably seen this thing before. This variant is the Philips CDI variant because there was a recolored version of it used for the Philips CDI, if I remember correctly. And you could put, like, a little stick on top of it. I've actually never... Oh, no, I was about to say I've never used it. That's a lie. I have. But it was for very briefly. And I remember it felt kind of lightweight. I remember the buttons being a little bit too shallow for their own good. I remember the D-pad feeling okay. It's sort of a firm kind of... right there in the middle. I'm not a big fan of the weird kind of decision to make one of the arms, like, up. It kind of almost looks like one of those controllers you see, like, in a cartoon. made by someone who have no idea how game controllers, other than like the Atari 2600 controller, work. Next up, we have the Philips CDI. I like to call it the spoon controller. I'm sure it actually has a name. It's the spoon controller. This thing is crap. This thing is pooped here, just like the CDI itself. If you look, that circular bit, that's, if I remember correctly, that's the D-pad. That's how you move, and these are the action buttons. So you'd have to hold it, and it'd be very difficult to reach the second button, first of all, like on the right. But even then, it would still be like annoying, and you'd probably get like hand cramps just trying to use this thing. It's dumb. It's a piece of crap. I don't understand. Next up is the Sega Dreamcast controller. This one is hard because I kind of like it, but it's also a case where it's like I acknowledge it's kind of outdated. And the D-pad is bad. I feel like I love 6th generation controllers, but I feel like the D-pad kind of got the short end of the stick that generation. And the the Sega Dreamcast is no different. I don't know why they decided to go with a more cross-style D-pad, and I'm surprised that they didn't get in trouble because I know that Nintendo held the patent on it for a while, but they didn't. They decided to go with but they didn't go with the usual shield or circular kind of style design they went with. They went with a cross-style D-pad, and I find that kind of weird and mystifying. The buttons feel pretty good, and I like their kind of pastel color scheme, especially against that kind of what I like to call classic PC white. The stick is alright. I wish it was a soft top. But it's not too bad. The triggers are surprisingly good. They're analog, and they actually feel surprisingly good. So, in a way, it's, like, the triggers are kind of revolutionary in a way. And on top of that, just the layout of it. Obviously, there was at least some inspiration from the Dreamcast controller with the Xbox's original controllers. And that doesn't surprise me too much because I do know that, if I remember correctly, Sega was actually talking with Microsoft about getting some of like their games on the Xbox, and even having some Dreamcast games be supported online with the Xbox, but that kind of fell through. So I'm not terribly surprised that they do share a bit of, I guess you could say, chemistry. I think it was a good controller for the time. I feel like it's aged quite a bit. I'm gonna put it here. Right smack down in the middle, B. It's perfectly good. Also, the little VMUs are pretty cute too. I actually kind of feel like the VMU D-pad is better than the regular Dreamcast controller D-pad. Ah, yes, the ColecoVision controller. This goes in pooped here. It's better than the Philips CDI controller, but it's still not good. It's still quite poor. It feels cheap when you pick it up. I don't know, at least I feel like it feels cheap. Like, the buttons feel kind of shallow. The stick is horrible. The stick is extremely stiff. And the plastic just, I wouldn't say it feels flimsy, but it doesn't feel premium, if that makes sense. And it's got that thing. It's got that damn thing that controllers did at the time where they're like, hey, let's add a numeric keypad. And then you have to use overlays. I have absolutely no idea why game controllers are doing that. While we're at that, Intellivision controller, slightly above because at least to me it looks a little bit nicer. It feels a little bit more sturdy. And the disc is not good, but I still like it better than the stiff stick. Why? Why would you do that? Why would you have that numeric keypad? These are like our classic arcade games. You don't need that many buttons. Next up is the Duke, and it sure is the Duke. The Duke is hard because, on one hand, I think that functionally everything around it is fine. It feels solid, all the buttons work alright, the sticks are fine, although I'm not a big fan of the shape of the heads, mostly the right stick. The problem with this thing is obvious. This thing is huge. Like, even comparing it to something like the Sega Saturn 3D Action Pad, which is quite large, this thing is huge. Like, it just feels big, and that's actually funny because holding it, it's not that heavy. It actually feels quite hollow. Not that it feels cheap, because the plastic feels really good, but, like, the actual controller itself feels kind of hollow. As well as, like, the weird egg shape of the buttons, and the fact that it's both somehow, like, a weird 4-button kind of setup, like the classic diamond, but it also has the white and black action buttons, which are set next to them, which almost kind of makes it like a 6-button, but kind of on a weird tilted axis. It's just a weird controller, and I don't want to put it in, like, I'll put it in, like, C. Part of me almost does think it's a little bit overhated. Like, I wouldn't put it in poop tier, but I wouldn't necessarily call it good either. It's definitely not very comfortable. Next up is the, S-Sync, it's the Neo Geo, arcade stick. Like, I believe when the Neo Geo originally came out, it actually came with this. I've never actually used it because I've never played on Neo Geo, but if it's anything from what I understand, I think it's good putting it like in a high B. as someone who hasn't used it, but from what I've heard, it's like it's a really good quality arcade stick for the time, and I love me a good arcade stick, so I'll put it right there in B. I don't really have too much else to say beyond that. And next up is the GameCube controller. Well, geez, I wonder where Fox is gonna put the GameCube controller. It's not like he's constantly, it's not like he went on about it over and over and over. It's going in S. I'm just gonna spoil this now. It is my favorite video game controller of all time. It's quirky, yes, but it is so comfortable. The only thing I dislike about it is the D-pad. Everything else is so good. Everything else, like the sticks feel really good, even with like the kind of offset head shapes. It feels surprisingly good. I like the weird button layout. I think it works really well for the kind of games that are on the GameCube, and it has my favorite analog triggers on any console. Maybe not the most idyllic for stuff like shooters or whatever, but I think it works really well. And it's cool because technically they work as both analog and digital triggers, because when you press down, there's this click that's the digital kind of trigger activating, and I think that that's really cool. It's kind of a shame that Nintendo doesn't really do analog triggers anymore, because I'd like to see that kind of come back. Okay, so next up is I'm going to do the Sega Saturn 3 button... Sega Saturn? Next up I'm going to do the Sega Genesis 3-button controller. And it's good. It's a good controller. It's a little big and the shape's a bit awkward, but the buttons all feel really good. The shield style D-pad is fantastic, and I'm honestly on and off whether or not I prefer the cross style or the shield style D-pad when it comes to classic games like this. The Sega Genesis controller works really well for stuff like Sonic the Hedgehog and Rocket Knight. It kind of sucks for stuff like fighting games and buttons that, like, controllers that require more buttons, because there's only 3 of them. And in games like Street Fighter, if I remember correctly, you had to it was either you had to press the start button to switch between like light and heavy, or you had to like press 2 of them at the time for light and heavy. It was something like that. Either way, it was awkward, and that kind of limits the usability of it a little bit. That, and again, it feels like the actual plastic is really high quality, but the actual shape of it I always felt like was a little bit weird. I'll give it like a high B. I think it's a high B. It's a good controller. It's a great looking controller. Like damn, that's a really good looking controller. I like it a lot. Okay, next up is the I believe this is the Sega Genesis 6 button. Now, the Sega Genesis 6 button, I think it feels a little bit cheaper overall. But this is the first 6 button. Technically, they had a second 6 button where the buttons were like huge and like the actual controller itself was small. It's not on this list, but it still feels a little bit cheaper than the 3 button, but it still feels like good quality. The shape I think is a little bit more comfortable. The D-pad and the buttons still feel just as good, although the buttons themselves are a little bit smaller. And the extra like 6 buttons, which I think is like an interesting alternative to Nintendo's diamond shape. I think it's an interesting alternative. Yeah, I'm gonna put this as a high A. I really like the 6. I really like the 6-button Genesis controller. For someone with slightly like, I don't have like tiny hands, but like I mean I guess I do, because I'm a tiny little bit of itty bitty little fennec. Sega Genesis 6-button controller I feel is more comfortable for my small fennec paws. Next up is the Atari Jaguar controller. This controller makes me mad because it could have been pretty okay. It would have if you just got rid of that stupid numeric keypad. I hate these things. It's why? And instead, all of your action buttons, like you've got 3 big primary action buttons, and I think it had triggers. Future Fox, if I remember to do this, edit in whether or not, do some research, edit in, remember whether it had like triggers. But like it could have been good. It's pretty much just like a Sega Genesis controller, except that there's like a stupid numeric keypad and the buttons are kind of like square. It's that numeric keypad. It makes it so uncomfortable. And the keypad itself, I might be misremembering, but I think it actually like can break pretty easily. Which for some games, I mean, you can't play those games. On top of that, the fact that it only had the 3 buttons when it came out meant that games were sort of fairly limited. And I believe it was 94 or whatever when the Atari 93, 94 when the Atari Jaguar came out. And that was only like 3 buttons, and that kind of limited what you could do. There was a 6-button variation released later, I believe, but by that point it was too little too late. Who cared about the Atari Jaguar? The Atari Jaguar controller, I'm going to put it like in C, just below the Duke. I think is a good place for it. Next up are the Joy-Cons. Joy-Cons, I already know where I'm putting them. They're right smack dab, like in the middle with like the Dreamcast controller. And the reason why is because I think, like in terms of what they can do, And in terms of comfort for what they are, I think they do what they do quite well. But it's undeniable that they don't feel as good as like a good premium controller, and moreover, the elephant in the room, the sticks. I mean, particularly on, I believe it was the left Joy-Con. There was like a lot of Joy-Con drift. Now, I will say that mine didn't start drifting for a long time. I had my original like Joy-Cons for a long time before I had to replace them. And I believe the newer ones don't have that issue nearly as much. And that's good, but I still don't think it's as comfortable as like just a regular controller, because you can like put them in the grip and it feels fine, or you can hold them kind of separately like a Wii remote and a nunchuck, and it does feel fine, but like if I'm gonna play on the TV, I'd rather have like the Pro Controller or something. Overall, they are small, they are a little unorthodox, and as cool as they are and as much stuff they have in there, I'm not confident putting them higher than like right smack dab in the middle, because I feel like that they have just as many pros as they do Joy-Cons. Next up is the Sega Master System controller. I actually don't have a lot of experience with this one. From what I remember, it's basically just like an NES controller, except it feels a little bit cheaper, the buttons are a little bit mushier, and the D-pad, or D-button as it's called, is like a weird kind of square version of like the shield design, but its central pivot's a little bit too shallow. I think later versions had a better central pivot. If I remember correctly, I remember like reading or watching a video where I think they use like ball bearings for the central pivot, which is a little weird. But I mean, you know, whatever you need to get done. I'm gonna put this as a kind of lower B, maybe above the Gravis pad now. Maybe above the Gravis pad, I would say. Next up is the N64 controller, and the N64 controller. This is tough because I kind of love it, but it's not very good. It's actually funny because much like with the Atari Jaguar controller, I think if you got rid of like, say, like that extra arm, or like how with the Atari Jaguar it has like the keypad, I think it could have been a little big and a little clunky, but it could have been better, I think. But the N64 controller is supposed to be like, you have multiple ways of playing your games. You could hold two arms, you could hold the middle arm and the right arm, you could hold the middle arm and the left arm, you could hold the left arm and the right arm, but I could think of like maybe I think it's only like a couple of games that let you even do that. I think it's like Mortal Kombat Trilogy, Mischief Makers, there's another one, I think Mortal Kombat Mythology Sub-Zero. You were primarily holding the middle stick and the right stick. And maybe if they had moved, like it's controversial opinion, especially since the N64 D-pad's actually quite good, if they just gotten rid of like the D-pad, I think, and then had like the stick up here, and then just made it flat at the bottom, it wouldn't have been perfect, but I think it could have been potentially better. With that said, I do think that, like, for what it is, it's pretty okay. There's better control options for the N64 now. It's a pretty sturdy feeling controller, except for that stick. To me, the biggest problem with it isn't necessarily the layout, it's the stick. The stick is not very good. It, aside from the fact that it's a hard plastic, which will, like, blister your hands when you're playing Mario Party, it also, sort of starts to get loose pretty easily. And, I understand it was, like, the first analog control stick on a mass market, on a mass market console, but now it's cheap. You know, Nintendo is weird. Sometimes they make really good control sticks, and sometimes it's the Joy-Cons and the N64. I'm gonna put it just after the Dreamcast controller. I actually feel like these two share kind of some similar things, which is pretty funny. This is the Neo Geo CD controller. I've never held this. It looks really cool. I love the look of it. I like the kind of micro switch control stick. I like the different colored like face buttons. The overall layout of it looks pretty good. It reminds me of like those fighting pads that they're called that you can get. It kind of reminds me of that. It looks good. I like it. It looks. I'm gonna put it next to the just under the stick, because I know some people who prefer the stick. Next up is the NES controller. I'm pretty confident putting the NES controller in A. I think that some people don't like it because it's too small, it digs into your hands. I've never had those issues. It's never dug into my hands. I found that I like that it's a simple controller. It doesn't have like a keypad or like 10 fire buttons or anything. It's just It's a D-pad, it's 2 buttons, it's start select, because for NES games, that's all you need. Not that that stopped some people making things like the Power Glove, but just as a pack-in, it's a good, comfortable controller, and I like it quite a bit. It looks really nice, the buttons feel good, the D-pad feels good, it feels pretty solid. It's a good controller. I would easily say it is an A tier at the very least. Next up is the Xbox One controller. I think this actually goes above the Xbox 360 controller, but only slightly. It's like very minor improvements over them. I feel like that it's a bit smaller, but I feel like the actual like mold of it's more comfortable. The sticks feel better. Like the stick tops feel fantastic with like the kind of concaveness and like the textured size. They feel really good. The D-pad's still not amazing with it. I think it's like micro switches or something, but it feels all right. It feels fine. It's better, definitely. It's definitely a much improvement. The overall look of it's also more premium, and it doesn't have a huge controller pack kind of jutting out the back, so that's a +2 in its favor. Oh look, it's the Ouya controller. This thing sucks. It doesn't feel like it actually should have come with a console. It feels like a Chinese bootleg. The plastic is cheap. The buttons are shallow. The sticks kind of like feel like that they grind against like they grind when you're using them. The triggers, they almost feel like that they're ready to come out at any moment. It's incredibly light. The only thing that's kind of neat is the touchpad, which yeah, cool. It's got a touchpad. So does the PS4 controller. The Ouya sucks. Okay, so next up is the 3DO controller. 3DO is like this weird system where it was technically made by a few different developers and blah, 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 blah. Anyway, the controller itself is basically just a not as good feeling Sega Genesis controller. It is smaller, and part of me almost prefers the shape, but it definitely feels cheaper. The buttons don't feel as good, the D-pad doesn't feel as good, but it doesn't feel bad. It doesn't feel bad. Its sort of main issue is that in order to do multiplayer, you had to stick a cord into the top of one of them, which was, yeah, we're getting rid of wires running along the floor. Great, but now there's wires running all over our laps. It's just, I'm gonna put it like, I think here's good. Ah, yes, the original PlayStation controller is up next. And, I think now is time for me to share some controversial opinions. As much as I love the PlayStation, never been super huge on the DualShock. I don't think it's bad. I just don't like it as much as like say the Xbox or many of Nintendo's controllers. The original, I'm gonna do these all kind of rapid fire because they're all pretty close. Although I will have a lot to say about the PlayStation controller. This one I think is about here. It just feels like, though it's not necessarily its fault, in a lot of ways. I feel like that the shoulder buttons, like the fact that they both feel kind of similar is a little bit weird. Never been a big fan of the DualShock D-pad. I just don't like it very much. I know that it is all one piece, but it's kind of like still weird that it's like 4 segmented parts. I'm not particularly fond of that. And it just feels weird without the sticks, man. It just doesn't feel right. Next up is the DualShock 1. I'm gonna say, yeah, about here is good, just above the Dreamcast controller. It feels a little bit more sturdy than the predecessor. The sticks being there does help a lot. For the time, the sticks were really good, but looking back, they do feel kind of a little bit like weird and mushroomy, though they weren't, like, they thankfully weren't too slippery or anything. And the shoulder buttons were, the R2 and L2 buttons were thankfully redesigned to feel different from the R1 and L1. So that definitely helps. It's pretty good overall. It's, again, DualShock, not my favorite series of controllers, but it's not too bad. DualShock 2 is the same thing. I'm going to put it slightly above because I think it looks cooler in black. And there's also technically, this is weird, and not a lot of people know this, the face buttons on the DualShock 2 are actually analog. No, I don't know why. I think the only game I think of off the top of my head is Metal Gear Solid 2 uses it, and even then I think it's something that you could completely ignore. I can't think of another game that uses that feature. I have no idea. Who? Why? For what purpose, Sony? For what purpose? Okay, so now we've got the PS3 control. This thing is garbage. I'm sorry. I don't like the PS3 controller. Here's the thing. It doesn't feel like an actual PlayStation controller. It feels like I got a bootleg of a PlayStation controller. I know I said something similar about like the Ouya feeling like a bootleg, but this thing feels like a bootleg of a specific product that I can already hold and use. And so it's like, it just feels like a crappy bootleg version of a DualShock. The plastic feels cheap, it feels really light, the triggers are terrible. Like, it literally just feels like that they took the old R1 and R2 and L2 buttons and just like raised them up. It just feels so stiff and uncomfortable. The D-pad I still don't like. The sticks feel like really cheap, like very much like the Ouya sticks actually. They feel very grindy. Like, it feels like that they're like grinding against the inside of the controller. The only real thing I can say is that, if I remember correctly, it has an alright battery life. I might be mistaken on that actually. And the face buttons feel alright. That's it. The only thing that's preventing it from being pooped here is the fact that the layout I still think is objectively fine. It's still that PlayStation layout, and that's objectively fine. But it's not a very good controller at all. I don't like the PS3 controller. Also, the 6-axis in it sucked. Next up is the PlayStation 4 controller, and, well, obviously the overall layout's still not my favorite. They made so many improvements to the PS4 controller. It feels more comfortable, the sticks feel great, like, the shape of them is great, the overall range of movement feels better. The D-pad is the same, though at least I find it feels a little bit sturdier, but that might just be me. Face buttons still feel good. The triggers are fantastic. They are so much better. They're so much less stiff, and they have this really great shape to them. The actual shape of the controller itself, it just feels like it melts into your hands. The actual like placement of buttons and sticks, again, not my favorite, but out of all of these kind of styles of controller, this is the best one, I think. I think it's a solid, I think it's an S. It's not one that I would always personally go for, but it is a really, really good controller, and I feel like not giving it a really high rating would be kind of doing it a disservice. So we got the DualShocks out of the way. Let's get back to Sega for a moment, because we've got the Sega Saturn American controller, or Model 1 as it's sometimes called. This controller's not very good. It's a pretty solid C tier. It works, it's fine. The face buttons feel good, but the D-pad is weird and squishy and overly designed. I don't know why they didn't just go with a traditional shield shape. Instead, they went with like this weird kind of wavy thing. It's uncomfortable. The overall shape of it isn't like very comfortable. Even looking at it now, it's got like these weird squared arms that just aren't very comfortable. And the bumpers, the shoulder buttons, are very cheap feeling. It's just not a very good controller, and I don't understand why we didn't just get the Sega Saturn, like the same pad in America. I mean, we did, but it took, I think, like a year before they started just selling this and calling it the model, like the Sega Saturn 2 and calling it the Model 2. And this one is an S tier controller. This controller, if you've ever felt it, it feels like this, but even better. The overall, like, feel of it is so comfortable. It feels so smooth in your hand. I think this is the best controller Sega ever made. I think it's one of the best 2D style controllers out there. It feels so good in your hands. The shoulder buttons feel good, even if they are shaped a little weirdly. The actual, like, the way you press them feels good. The D-pad is that classic Sega, like, shield D-pad, and it feels amazing. It feels so good. And the buttons themselves are like the 6 buttons on the 6-button Genesis controller, except that they feel a little bit more sturdy. And just overall, it's just a really, really damn good controller. It feels good, it feels sturdy, it's high quality, it's comfortable in your hands. It's a classic, alright? Alright, next up is the Snes Controller. This one I think is a pretty high A. Admittedly, I do feel like that, at least with, I know there's technically 2 revisions of it. I feel like, with the second revision, it feels a little bit more plasticky and a little bit more creaky. At least the, I guess you could say the shell of it does. But everything else is top-notch. The buttons are top-notch. The D-pad feels really good. The shoulder buttons were a really great addition, and they feel good. The start and select buttons don't feel great, but they're just for menus, who cares? Again, they kept it simple, and they kept it to the point, and pretty much every modern controller owes this kind of, at least button layout, and the idea of shoulder buttons to the Snes controller. Okay, next up is the Steam controller. I have never used this thing, but I don't like, just from what I've seen of it, I'm not a big fan of like the weird kind of, instead of control sticks, we have like these weird touch things. Well, we do have a control stick, but it's tiny and soft to the side, and instead we have like these weird, I guess, touchpad whatever. No, I'm sorry. Also, from what I understand, it feels kind of like crap too. Like I know that the arms are like a little bit bulbous at the end. I'm not sure how I would feel about that. I guess I do. You know what? No, I think that's a little bit harsh. I think I'm gonna put it about here. And the reason why I'm putting it here, because at least I appreciate that they tried to do something different. And maybe for certain types of games, the touchpads could actually be like an improvement over the traditional sticks. I just don't see it, frankly. I don't think it's very good. Okay, next up, we've got the Nintendo Switch Pro Controller. This one is... I think this is the best controller that Nintendo's put out since the GameCube. I think it's a solid S. I'm a little bit on and off as to whether or not I prefer the Xbox One controller. I think I'm going to put the Xbox One controller above it, but only slightly, and only for the fact because it has the analog triggers. The Nintendo Switch Pro Controller has digital triggers, and they feel good, they feel fine. The analog triggers technically allow for more like movement and whatnot. Other than that, it is so good. The only thing that I think is lacking is the original models, the D-pads. Weren't terrible, they were fine, but they didn't feel up to quality to Nintendo's usual D-pads. But they were later re-released with better D-pads, and I felt the better D-pad as well. And yeah, it's a big improvement. It feels a lot better. But everything else, from the like how good the sticks feel, both like the stick heads and the range of movement on the sticks, the big clacky buttons. I love the big clacky buttons. They feel so good to press. The shoulder buttons and the triggers both have like a really nice feel and shape to them. It's got NFC. It's got a very good battery life of about 40 hours. It's got motion controls and whatnot. It's a really, really, really excellent controller, and I think it's one of the finest ever made. I actually feel like this generation we've been kind of spoiled by controllers in a way, which is kind of neat. Okay, so next up, TurboGrafx 16 controller. I've never held this thing. It kind of just looks like a crappy bootleg NES controller. I'm gonna put it here. I really don't know what else to say. It just, I don't know. The D-pad looks, to me, from what I've seen of it, it looks kind of stiff and a little bit sharp on the edges, and the buttons look a little small. It just kind of looks like a not as well proportioned out NES controller. Next up is the Vectrex controller. I've never used this because I've never used a Vectrex. I have no idea how I feel about it. I think it looks kind of neat, and from what I understand, it is pretty neat for what it is. I'm gonna put it here, I think, just before the Gravis pad. Not too bad, but like I'm not really sure what to make of it. Same with this. I think I might have been a little bit too harsh on a TurboGrafx 16 controller. I'm sure it's fine. I'm sure it's a perfectly good controller. That's why I put it in B instead of C or poop tier. Next up is the Virtual Boy controller. You know, I've heard some people say it's like really bad. I don't think it's really bad. I just think it's kind of bad. I think that there's some things about it I kind of like. The arms, the long arms are pretty cool and almost kind of a forefather to the controllers that we have now with the long arms. The two D-pads are something that I see a lot of people talk about, and I think it's kind of interesting because it, much like the arms, it's almost like a predecessor to the double stick, like the twin stick kind of like we have in controllers now. The arms themselves also have like these weird kind of indents for you to stick your fingers in, which are nice, but the kind of hard plastic, you're kind of pressing against them. I don't know, this one is weird as hell. I'm gonna put it like a top C. I think I'm gonna put it like a high C. Okay, so the Wii Classic Controller. Hot take, I'm not huge on this controller. I think that the overall like feel of it is fine. It's got decent quality plastic. It's the SNES layout, but not quite as good because it's a little bit, if you look, the arms don't protrude out as much. The D-pad feels really good. The buttons feel really good. The sticks are okay, a little bit too springy for their own good, but they're way too close together to use for any kind of gaming. Like, they're too close. Way too close to each other. I find it uncomfortable. The wire sticks out the bottom, kind of like the Dreamcast controller, except you don't really have a way to, like, there isn't like a little indent that you could stick up into it or anything. It's just down there, and that's something you have to live with. Although, admittedly, if you've got it plugged into a Wii, it's kind of wireless. It's kind of wireless. It's weird. It's weird. Also, this is so weird. It has like these shoulder buttons and these little like other shoulder buttons that I almost want to call like nipple buttons because they're like these tiny little things. Got nipple buttons trending on Twitter. Anyway, and like the shoulder buttons are analog, which on one hand, yay, analog shoulder buttons, but on the other hand, they're not like triggers. They're like SNES shoulder buttons, but they're like protruding out and they're analog. This controller's weird. I think it's not terrible. It's good quality. D-pad feels good. But just overall, it's so unusual. I'm gonna put it like a low B. But it's a redesign. The Pro Controller, I think it deserves like a high B. I think it deserves a high B. A high B. They addressed the issues of the sticks being too close together, but the sticks themselves still feel a little bit too springy for their own good, and don't have as much range of motion as, like, at least they don't feel like they have as much range of motion as, like, even like the GameCube controller. The layout of it is the PlayStation layout, which, like I said, I'm not super huge on, but it's not terrible. A lot of people prefer that layout, so it's not a huge deal. The buttons still feel good. The D-pad is still excellent. The shoulder buttons and the triggers, quote-unquote, the ZL and ZR, all feel really good now. It's not like the weird raised SNES shoulder buttons. It's like proper, like, PlayStation 2 style shoulder buttons, and they feel so good. I bring them up in the video. When I bought them, the whole time I was just clickety-clacking them on my way home because they just felt so good to clickety-clack. I suppose we'll take this time to kind of like round out this kind of series with the Wii U Pro Controller, which I think is kind of the unsung hero of the console. We'll talk about the gamepad in a minute, but like the Wii U Pro Controller, I think is one of like the best. I think, actually placing it is hard because there are actually things I like about it more than like the Xbox 360 controller, but then there's things I don't like as much. I think I'll put it S just above the PS4 controller. I know a lot of people are probably gonna think I'm insane for that because of, I think the main reason why a lot of people sleep on it is the stick layout. Both of the sticks are symmetrical, but instead of being down like on the PlayStation, they're on the upper half of the controller, which I know a lot of people don't like. I thought it was really weird at first. I got used to it really quickly. And the sticks themselves are surprisingly comfortable. We've got like this nice tiny little ridge around the center that help keep your thumb in place, and even then the plastic is really good. The actual range of motion on them is about as good as the Switch Pro controller. It feels so good to move around, so freeform. The buttons all feel really good, and the D-pad is fantastic. Though I do feel like trying to use like the D-pad with the buttons, that's when I feel like that the layout kind of gets in the way of that. The shoulder buttons and the triggers feel fine. I wish they were analog. They're very similar shape to the Xbox 360s. But the fact that the ZL and ZR, the triggers aren't analog, is kind of weird to me. They're fine. Otherwise, though, beyond that, I actually prefer the mold of it to the 360 and the Xbox One. It's a little bit bigger, but it's also a little bit flatter, if that makes sense. And it just feels kind of nice and snug in your hands when you pick it up. It just feels like almost like it's melting in there. But I can't deny that the layout does kind of get in the way of its usage for like 2D games or whatever. Which, I mean, to be fair, the Xbox 360 having a terrible D-pad kind of gets in the way of that too. But it also has like probably the best battery life of any mainstream wireless controller at about 80 hours. That's really impressive. I think its main drawback, other than that, is the fact that not every game could support it. You couldn't use it for certain functions, like certain menu functions, and you couldn't use it on like your PC without finagling with it, like for the PS3 controller or whatever, which is incredibly unfortunate because it's a really good controller and I wish it had a little bit more longevity, but like as it stands, it doesn't work on your Switch, it doesn't work on your PC, it doesn't even work with all of your Wii U games. So as cool as it is, and the fact that it's actually pretty cheap too, it's because it didn't have NSC or motion controls or anything, it does have rumble. Some people think it doesn't have rumble for some reason. It was nice and cheap when it came out compared to other controllers, but it still feels good in quality. So don't worry about it feeling cheap. It still feels really good in quality, but you didn't have to pay as much. But be careful for bootlegs. There's actually a surprising amount of bootlegs for the Wii U Pro Controller. Okay, so next up we've got the let's do the Xbox, the Xbox Controller S first. This thing is like a huge improvement over the Duke in almost every regard. It's still a little bit clunky, but it's definitely a lot better. I do find the placement of the pause and like options buttons, I think they're called, I think they're called like start and back, are very, very weird. They're like just above the left arm, in between the left stick and the D-pad. That is so unusual. I don't get that. The black and white buttons have been moved to the same spot on the opposite side, which is Again, very weird. So no more pseudo 6-button layout. It's now trying its best to be 4-button layout. The buttons are no longer ovals, which is nice. And the overall feel of it's a lot... I actually feel like it's even sturdier. The plastic feels even higher quality. It doesn't feel nearly as hollow for its size. The triggers still feel fantastic. The sticks feel better. They feel about the same as the Xbox 360 sticks, I think. It's a really good controller. I just feel like that the Xbox 360 controller and pretty much every modern controller outdoes it. And obviously the GameCube controller, but the GameCube controller is my baby. I'm gonna put it like a solid A, about here. I think it's a really good controller, but it's obviously been outclassed by its successors, which should happen. That's what should happen, guys. That's what should happen. Okay. Next up is the Wii U Gamepad. The Wii U Gamepad is interesting. In a lot of respects, it's kind of why the Wii U failed. The thing about the Wii U Gamepad is, while people like me think, oh, you have a second screen, which you can use for asymmetrical gameplay, we can use for playing off the TV, whatnot. We think that's cool, but most people don't get the appeal. It's not like motion controls where you're like, oh, well, anyone can grasp that. Aunt Agnes can understand that. Oh, now I'm the controller, and it looks like a remote. It's something that she can get into. A weird tablet controller, that just doesn't fly. It doesn't have as much appeal. On top of that, the battery life was crap, and a lot of games forced you to use it when it wasn't necessary. When you kind of look at it, you're like, this game would have been better without the Wii U gimmicks. But on the plus side, it's very comfortable despite its girth. It doesn't feel too heavy. The actual, like, mold of it is surprisingly comfortable considering it's basically just like a big old brick. It's got like these nice kind of grooves on the inside where you can rest your fingers and you can rest your hands. It's surprisingly good. The symmetrical sticks on the upper half actually makes sense given the size of it. The kind of fat pad-like triggers feel really good. They are still digital, but like, you know, the D-pad and the buttons are the same as they are on the Wii U Pro Controller, so they feel fantastic. The touchscreen's alright. It's kind of low resolution, and it's only like, it's not multi-touch, so even by the time it came out in 2013, it felt a little bit toyish. On top of that, and this is also kind of extended to the Pro Controller, the glossy plastic looks nice for like 5 minutes, and then your thumbprints and dirt get all over it, and you're just like, well, there you go. So much for showing this thing off. I think it's right smack dab in the middle. It's a perfectly good controller, but I won't deny that it definitely caused the Wii U some issues. And lastly, we have perhaps the most controversial controller on the whole list. Ladies and gentlemen, we have the Wiimote. Ooh, oh man, do people love to hate the Wiimote. This thing is kind of blamed for a lot of, I guess you could say, design decisions that would kind of plague the later half of the 7th gen of consoles, because the Wii did so well, and then everyone wanted to jump on that bandwagon. Technically, even before that, because the PS3 controller, it ditched like Rumble at first. It would get it later, but it ditched Rumble at first for the sake of having motion controls. And as it stands on its own, it is kind of a basic controller. It's kind of a sort of outdated kind of motion controller. It doesn't have a stick. You have to have the nunchuck for that. It's got a fairly limited amount of buttons. But the fact that it's a remote was such a smart idea, because anyone can grasp that it's a remote. Anyone can grasp that idea because people are already familiar with like TV remotes and whatnot. On top of that, it feels surprisingly comfortable in your hand, the way that it's shaped. The buttons and the D-pad all feel quite good, although holding it on its side, it feels kind of weird and lopsided. Using it with a nunchuck is surprisingly good for certain games. It does kind of have the Wii U problem where a lot of the times you kind of feel like it was a bit intrusive, where it was like, okay, well, why do I need to use this in, like, say, I don't know, like in the Wii version of Twilight Princess, other than, hey, you guys, we gotta show off the motion controls. But for what it was, and for when it came out, as being this kind of thing that really helped, like, in a lot of respects, it did help push gaming forward, in both negative and in positive ways. And I love the Wii, so I have a soft spot for this thing. Now, when I'm playing Wii games, generally, if I can help it, I'm either using the GameCube or the Classic Controller Pro. But I also not too upset, depending on the game, if I do have to use the Wii Remote and the nunchuck. Like in Mario Galaxy, it's fine. In Epic Mickey, it's quite good because it uses the pointer, which I legitimately think is the best thing about it. But I don't know. This is a hard one for me. I'm gonna be a bit controversial. I'm gonna put it A minus. I'm gonna put it on A minus. And I know people are gonna get mad because of that. But you're wrong. So here's the completed tier list. On poop tier, we have the Philips CDI Spoon Controller being the worst, and the Ouya Controller being the best of the worst. For C tier, we have I don't know what this is, being the worst, mostly by default, and the Virtual Boy Controller being the best of the kind of not great tier. For the worst of the pretty alright, we've got the Wii Classic Controller. For the best of the pretty alright, like the pretty good, I would say, we've got the 3-button Genesis Controller. For the worst of the good, like the great, we've got the Wii Remote, and for the best of the great, we've got the Snes Controller, and for the best of the best, on the bottom of that, we've got the PS4 controller, and the best of the best, we've got the GameCube controller. No, I'm not an old man. Shut up.